Victim attorneys called it one of the single most egregious violations of victim privacy in modern American history. Pam Bondi called it less than 1% error. Survivor names published, addresses published, nude photographs published, Jane Doe's protected for decades, exposed, less than 1% error. The height of the Eiffel Tower in documents. 500 attorneys working around the clock. And still, somehow, the names of survivors got out while the names of powerful men stayed hidden. Watch how she explains that.
Questions?
Madam Attorney General,
Sure.
earlier this month, a bipartisan group of lawmakers on the House Oversight Committee voted to subpoena you to appear for a closed-door deposition. Will you commit to complying with that subpoena and appearing for a closed-door deposition?
I made it crystal clear I will follow the law.
But
Next
does that
question.
mean you will- does that
Next
mean you will
question.
Victim attorneys say that the release of Epstein, identifying of Epstein victims, was one of the single most egregious violations of victim privacy in modern American history. You built your career on being a victim advocate.
Yeah.
Will you apologize to the victims? What do you have to say for that conduct?
Can you explain what you mean by identify? You mean victims' names that were released that shouldn't have been?
Exactly.
Yeah,
and then
so-
also other
Yeah,
identifying
so
victims.
under the Epstein Transparency Act, we had 30 days to redact and release, under the law that was passed, 3 million documents. If you stack those up, that's the height of the Eiffel Tower. No other administration, under the Biden administration, they released 0 documents. So we did our very best to comply with the law. And of course, we don't want any victim to be further victimized. And that's why we had 500 attorneys with the Criminal Division, with the National Security Division, with the FBI working around the clock to do the best we could. I think it was less than 1% error. Todd, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, that's right.
Less than 1% error. That is how Pam Bondi described publishing the names, addresses, nude photographs, and identities of trafficking survivors who had been legally protected for decades. Less than 1% error. Out of 3 million documents, less than 1% means up to 30,000 individual errors. 30,000 documents where something went wrong, where a name that should have been redacted was published, where a photograph that should have been protected was released, where a Jane Doe who had a court order protecting her identity for 20 years was suddenly exposed. Less than 1% error sounds small. 30,000 potential mistakes affecting survivors of child sex trafficking does not sound small. And here's the thing about Blanche's claim that mistakes were fixed immediately. Immediately. The damage of publishing a survivor's name is not fixed by taking the document down. The name is already out. It has already been seen. It has already been shared. It has already reached the survivor's family members, who in some cases were finding out for the first time that their loved one had been trafficked by Epstein. You cannot unring that bell. Immediately means nothing to a woman whose family found out she was trafficked because the DOJ published her name in a public document. And Bondi's defense for all of this? Biden released 0 documents. 3 times she said it. Biden released 0. We released 3 million. We worked harder than anyone. We did our best. This is the deflection technique she has been using since day one. The question is not whether Biden released documents. The question is whether Bondi's department followed the law when it released them. The Epstein Files Transparency Act required survivor identities to be protected. It required perpetrator names to be disclosed. Bondi's department did the opposite. Survivor names published. Perpetrator names redacted. That is not a Biden problem. That is a Bondi problem. And when a reporter asked if she will comply with the subpoena, her answer was 3 words. I will follow the law. Not, yes, I will appear on April 14th. Not, I look forward to answering these questions under oath. I will follow the law. Next question. That is not a commitment to appear. That is a non-answer dressed up as a principal. And the DOJ official who dismissed the subpoena as pointless the same day it was issued is now standing next to Bondi at a press conference saying they came to answer any question Congress wanted to ask. Except Democrats on the committee walked out. They called it a fake hearing. Said Bondi was trying to get around appearing for a real deposition. Said the whole thing was designed to give her cover to avoid sworn testimony. And Bondi's response? One congresswoman screamed that C-SPAN was not there, so they did not want to ask questions. That is her explanation for why Democrats walked out of a hearing about the most important sex trafficking case in American history. One congresswoman wanted cameras, therefore, fake hearing.
We said from the beginning that any mistakes that were made, and there should be no mistakes. And so when you say lawyers have said something, that's not a fair question, and you know it, because we took pains to protect victims. When when someone identified that there was a victim, we immediately pulled that document down, fixed it, and put it back up
Immediately.
And so of course we don't ever want to do anything to re-victimize anybody that was victimized by the horrible crimes of Mr. Epstein, but we didn't to the extent that mistakes were made, and there were mistakes made because of the reasons the Attorney General just said. But when they were identified to us, we fixed them immediately.
And let me be clear on this case. This case has spanned multiple administrations. It started under Bush. It went to Obama. It went to Biden. We were the only, no documents were released, only under the Trump administration. And we released 3 million documents, had 500 attorneys working on that, complying with the law the best we could, and protecting victims in doing it.
Madam Attorney General,
Go
this
ahead.
has been quite an odyssey for you. This began with an encounter you had with some activists in the Roosevelt Room where you handed out some binders. Then there was a discussion, a statement that the FBI and DOJ put out that this investigation was over. Flash ahead to a couple of weeks ago, you had a very unusual appearance before the House Judiciary Committee. Do you have any regrets? Is there anything you might have done differently? And do you think that your comportment and the department's comportment in this have exacerbated the public's lack of trust in this process?
Well, let me repeat what I just said. This has spanned 4 administrations. Bush, Obama, Trump won, 45, where Jeffrey Epstein was prosecuted, and then Joe Biden's administration, where 0 documents were provided.
Democrats walked out. Let me tell you why that matters. This was not a formal public hearing. This was a voluntary closed-door briefing, the one Bondi rushed to arrange the same day the subpoena dropped. No cameras, no public record, no C-SPAN. Democrats came prepared with questions about why survivor names were published, why powerful men's identities were redacted, why the 3 FBI interview summaries about a woman accusing Trump of sexual assault when she was 13 were withheld, why the client list Bondi said was on her desk never appeared, why Blanche met alone with Maxwell 2 days before she was transferred to Club Fed, and Bondi and Blanche showed up at their own convenience to a meeting they arranged on their own terms, on their own timeline, with no cameras, no oath, no perjury risk. Democrats said this is not a real hearing. This is a performance designed to let Bondi say she cooperated with Congress so she can then avoid the actual sworn deposition on April 14th. And Bondi says they walked out because one congresswoman wanted C-SPAN. Now, let me tell you what actually happened in that room based on what we know. Bondi and Blanche came. They answered some questions. They deflected others. Democrats concluded that the voluntary briefing was designed specifically to give Bondi political cover to argue she had already cooperated and therefore did not need to sit under oath. That is the plea bargain strategy the congressman described the night before. Come in voluntarily. Control the narrative. Avoid the deposition. And then walk out and tell the press, We answered any question they wanted to ask. They just screamed about cameras and left. Here is what she did not address in that press conference. She did not explain why the 3 Trump accusation interviews were withheld. She did not explain who ordered Maxwell's transfer to Club Fed. She did not explain what Blanche discussed with Maxwell alone. She did not explain why the client list she said was on her desk has never materialized. She did not explain why 1,200 identified victims, her own number, were not protected adequately under a law that specifically required their protection. She said less than 1% error. She said 3 million documents. She said the height of the Eiffel Tower. She said Biden released 0. And then she said, next question. Thank you. Have a good night. The subpoena is still active. April 14th is still on the calendar. The question is whether the Republican chairman who issued that subpoena, Jim Comer, accepts this voluntary briefing as sufficient, or whether he pursues sworn testimony with the same relentlessness he brought to investigating the Clintons. Because the survivors who stood in that hearing room and raised their hands, every single one of them not yet met with by the DOJ, are still waiting. They did not get their apology. They did not get their names protected. They did not get the accountability the Epstein Files Transparency Act promised them. What they got was a press conference where the Attorney General said less than 1% error and then said, have a good night. Share this video. Because April 14th matters and people need to be watching. Subscribe, new video every week. Drop a comment. Do you think Bondi shows up for the April 14th sworn deposition? Or does she find a way out? Because everything she did this week was designed to avoid that chair.